So, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me speak today on the topic of forever pesticides and their forever pieces. And really, what this title means is it's a play on the name that PFAS chemicals were given, which were forever chemicals, because of the strength of this carbon and fluorine bond, which makes them very persistent in the environment. And so, this talk will be about pesticides that are PFAS, as well as their degradation products, or these forever pieces that might have important environmental implications. And so earlier this year, I was a co-author on a publication on this very topic that was really led by Nathan Donnelly from the Centers for Biological Diversity. And I know he gave a presentation last year at this very conference on the sort of initial findings of this paper. And so I won't spend too much time on this paper, but the idea of this presentation is sort of to give you an update on where this field is going and what we've learned since this publication has come out, since the concept of forever pesticides or PFAS pesticides is really rapidly evolving. And so we started this work basically because some publications in Europe were indicating that this process of fluorination of agrochemicals or pesticides was really increasing in recent years, particularly to impart stability in these compounds so that they sort of functioned better as pesticides. And so we decided to take a comprehensive review of what this meant in the United States. And what we found were that pesticide active ingredients were plentiful in terms of those that met the OECD definition for PFAS. About 66 chemicals met that definition, meaning they had a CF3 group that was added to the chemical structure of the pesticide. And those were used in about 24 to 35 million pounds in 2018. One thing we were really concerned about is that these compounds are likely highly persistent, either as parent compounds or degradates, and I'll get into that a little bit later. We also looked at inert ingredients as a source of PFAS, and these are part of the pesticide product. They're just not considered the active ingredient, but they could also meet the definition of PFAS and be a source of PFAS in the environment. And then lastly, we focused on this contamination of pesticide products with PFAS from fluorinated containers. And I know there was a talk at the first part of this conference from a scientist at USGS looking at some of the implications of that as well. And these are just some examples of what those PFAS pesticide looks like. And so really the takeaway here is that this is a diverse group of chemicals with really broad structures, but what they have in common is at least one of these CF3 groups. And some of them are very highly fluorinated, some are used in really high amounts. Some of them have been detected in water, and then some of them all the way on the right here are these inert ingredients. And so these are just some of the chemicals that I'll be focusing on in the rest of this talk. And as I mentioned, the goal of this is really to look at what trends are happening in PFAS active ingredients, how that might differ from country to country, state to state even, so that we can effectively make sort of priority and policy targets based on those trends and how much data we know. I'd also say we're kind of in this information gathering stage. Like I mentioned, Europe has sort of been setting the stage on this research for a little while. And I think here in the US, we're still starting to catch up a bit. So, first of all, in terms of the number of approved PFAS pesticides, that number actually differs depending on where you look. So, in the US, we have about 66, which makes up about 14% of all of the active ingredients approved in the US. But in the EU and France, that is almost half. There's about 37 approved in the European Union, 30 in France, and then even a fewer amount in Denmark. Interestingly, even though there's fewer approved chemicals in the EU and France, that 12 to 14% seems to still be consistent. And that's the amount of PFAS active ingredients as a percentage of the total pesticides that active ingredients that are approved. And so in the US, this is a figure from our paper. One thing that we saw was that in terms of the percentage of active ingredients that are PFAS, that number was increasing in recent years. So if the pesticide had been approved in the last 10 years, there's, 30% of those were PFAS, whereas on a whole, 14% of them were PFAS. So that might indicate that there's a trend here where pesticides are increasingly becoming fluorinated or meeting this definition of PFAS. Interestingly, in France, there was a report from Pesticide Action Network that saw an increase in sales in these products. And similarly, there was a recent publication from Poulsen et al. This year that looked at the detections of these pesticides in food and also saw that that was increasing. So hopefully I'm going to be able to give you a little bit of info on what their use is like in the United States, and I'll focus on California as well as Maryland, and then what the presence of these are like in the US food supply as well. And so, for anybody who researches sort of pesticide use and what that looks like on a state level, everyone turns to California because they have not only are they a really big agricultural economy, but they have really good data when it comes to pesticide monitoring. So, the state's required to report the amount of pesticides used and the location in which they're sprayed. So, what I did here was basically take those groups of 66 PFAS active ingredients that I was talking about and look to see how much of those had been applied in California from 2000 to 2022. And so these graphs essentially show the years on the bottom, the pounds applied on the y-axis, and each color represents a different PFAS pesticide. And the graph here on the left represents all of the pesticides applied that are PFAS, of which there were 50 different ones. And the graph on the right here just has a couple of them removed so we could look at some other trends. So if you look at all the PFAS pesticides, one thing to notice is this big orange bar, which seems to be decreasing. This represents an herbicide called trifluoroacetic. And this is actually a trend that you see nationwide as well, where it was sort of heavily used in the 90s, and then its use has been decreasing. And so if you sort of remove that from the graph here, you see that there actually is an increased trend in terms of the amount of pesticides applied. And some of them, oxyfluorophane seems to be the most prevalent, as well as an increase in penthiopirid. And then some of these others are a little bit lesser volume. I should say that this makes up about 2 million pounds of the pesticides applied, which is about 1% of overall pesticides in California. One thing that's kind of interesting about these pesticides is that although they don't seem to make up a large percentage of sort of the pounds applied, because of their persistence, they might be more likely to be detected in the environment. And we saw that with some initial water sampling data that we were looking at that's published in our paper. And so if we look at this data from a more regional perspective, in Maryland, we can look at the pesticide use surveys that are collected from 2014, 2020, and 2022. And I should just mention that these data are a little bit more limited than the ones in California. This is more of a voluntary survey where less than 10% of the farms are actually reporting pesticide use. So this could be potentially an underestimate, but because we're sort of working in a limited data space, having some data on pesticide use is far better than not having any data here. So these graphs are organized the same way. And really the takeaway here is that there are different trends and different pesticides used in Maryland compared to California. And that makes sense, but we still have, around 200,000, 150 to 200,000 pounds sort of annually being used of these pesticides in Maryland. One interesting trend here is this decrease in fipronil. One thing I want to mention, though, is that fipronil can also be used in flea and tick medicines, and that can be a significant contribution to fipronil detected in waterways. The other thing I want to mention over here on this graph on the right is this potential increase in cyhalothrin, which is an insecticide. So again, regional and specific differences in how these types of pesticides are used, which could be really important for, potential regulation or policy that might want to be used in the future. And so coming back to potential food detections and that study that I mentioned earlier on an increase in PFAS pesticides as reported in Danish food, what they found was 11 out of the 40, so roughly about 28% of these PFAS active ingredients could be detected in food, and that those were increasing if you looked over time from 2004 to 2022. What I think is interesting here is that there are far fewer PFAS active ingredients approved in Denmark and the EU compared to the US. So if you actually look at this in US foods, what we see is that 33, as opposed to 11, PFAS active ingredients are regularly detected in US foods. And that's about, 50% or so of those PFAS active ingredients that are approved for use in the US. And this data comes from the USDA Pesticide Data Program, which collects thousands of samples of different commodities each year and tests them for hundreds of pesticides. And so I looked at 52 commodities that were sampled from 2017 to 2023 and found that about 39 of those commodities had at least 5% of samples with one or more PFAS pesticide. And really, that's just a way of saying that these are sort of widely detected in US foods. And these are primarily fruits and vegetables that are collected. Some of the more prevalent ones are fludioxonil, bifenthrin, and fluopyram. And I'll show you a little bit more specific data in these next slides. So this is a figure that shows essentially those 39 commodities that had at least one PFAS pesticide detected in 5% of samples. And then this y-axis represents just the number of PFAS pesticides detected. So there's a range here. Some of these fruits and vegetables like watermelon, tangerine, sweet potatoes only have one PFAS pesticide detected, but others like kale, grapes, sweet peppers, have 6 to 8. And these commodities over here on the left, these do tend to have more pesticides detected on them, likely just because of sort of the pest pressures of growing these crops. But that is not unique to just, PFAS pesticides. So they're sort of widely detected across fruits and vegetables that are sort of readily consumed by the US population. And then if you just flip this the other way to say, okay, well, which pesticides, these ones down here on the bottom, are often found, this is a representation of how many commodities they're found on. You see that again, fluopyram, bifenthrin, and fludioxonil are some of the most prevalent ones. And I just color-coded this by fungicide, insecticide, and herbicide. There's just trifluorolin's the only herbicide down here to sort of show you that these are primarily readily detected, but not unique on their function, right? So you'll find fungicides as well as insecticides, not so many herbicides, which would make sense for sort of a food analysis. And what's sort of interesting is, although these are the ones that are most prevalently detected, all 52 of the commodities that I looked at had at least one detection of a PFAS pesticide. So again, widely detected in US foods. And so I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about the breakdown products of this group of pesticides, specifically this metabolite or degradant called TFA or trifluoroacetic acid. Basically, any pesticide that has this CF3 group, if you remember the images I showed in the beginning, can essentially break down into this ultra short chain PFAS. And we're beginning to learn that this might be sort of a terminal or primary degradation product of a variety of different PFAS sources. And the reason that this is important is because particularly when EPA is registering pesticides, they're required to do short degradation studies to sort of assess what those degradants might be. And you do see that some TFA forms in those studies, but not necessarily in every pesticide product. And even more importantly, the EPA doesn't necessarily consider it that relevant because it only looks at the toxicity of the degradants. And currently, the thinking is that TFA is generally less toxic than some of these parent ingredients, but I would caution that and just say that's sort of a huge data gap that's just beginning to be understood. What's interesting about regulations in Europe is that they tend to look more at the persistence of a degradant as a potential problem. And we know that TFA is going to be extremely persistent in the environment because, again, it is a PFAS and it can't really be degraded any further. And so while we have some understanding that TFA is a terminal degradant, I just wanted to show that this is a very complex process that we're still beginning to understand. This is just the degradation pathway of one of those PFAS pesticides. And so there might be these other intermediates formed. This might vary depending on the environment that the pesticide is used in, but they're all really important considerations for where, when, and how we use these pesticides. There's also been some recent studies that show now that we're starting to monitor for these short chain, ultra short chain PFAS, they're really dominant in these environmental samples. So if you're looking at dust in somebody's home, you might find that these short chain PFAS make up most of the sample that you're collecting. And I think that's also been true in some water samples as well as some human blood samples. And the reason we're beginning to be so concerned about this is that there have been a couple really good review papers, one which was just published, I think, a couple months ago, that's showing that these numbers of TFA in the environment are wildly increasing in a lot of different samples. So this graph just shows all these different places that you might measure or find TFA, like plants and animals, human serum, water, dust. And the comparison here is between the green bar, which are pre-2010 samples, and the red bars, which are post-2010 samples. And in virtually every case, the red bars are higher. So just indicating overall increasing contamination of the environment with TFA. And there's a variety of sources this come from. Notably, pesticides is on here. And this figure on the bottom here just shows that actually it's very hard to remove from drinking water. So that's another potential concern. And as I mentioned, pesticides are one of the places that TFI can get in the environment, but there's some research that shows they might actually be a really dominant source. So this data comes out of Germany, which has really good water monitoring data for TFA. And what they're finding is that basically in areas of agricultural activity, you have higher TFA in the drinking water or in surface water concentrations compared to, less agricultural areas. And another study that pointed to really TFA coming from agricultural sources was they're present in food. So when you looked at conventional food compared to organic samples in Europe, you also saw that there was higher TFA in those conventional food samples, which I think is the thought is that it primarily comes from TFA contamination in fields where they can be taken up by those fruits and vegetables. It might also be the use of PFAS pesticides on food and the potential degradation of those on the food samples. But here in the US, we actually don't have any TFA sampling in US foods that I'm aware of. And our water sampling is also really scarce. But this group in Europe actually put together a map that showed the estimated TFA potential from the use of all these PFAS active ingredients that I've been talking about. And they basically estimate that there's about 1,500 to 5,000 tons. This is really widespread. A lot of that is coming from just 5 active ingredients, 4 of which are actually not approved in the European Union. And as you can see in the figure, there are lots of regional differences depending on the crops that are grown in these areas and which pesticides are used. And if you look at Maryland specifically, these estimated potential TFA levels from PFAS active ingredients is somewhere around 25,000 to 85,000 pounds of TFA annually. And that can come ranges in a variety of different counties, primarily ones that have higher agricultural use, and pesticides applied are going to contribute more to this potential TFA formation in the environment, and that it can be a potential groundwater contaminant. And so just to follow up on some takeaways and regulatory recommendations, we made sort of a series of recommendations from our findings in the paper, and I think they still apply here as well with some of this newer data. Basically, that use patterns and trends are likely regional and crop dependent, and that understanding the persistence of these chemicals is incredibly important, and in some cases can really be considered as a basis for regulation. That's something that we see in Europe, particularly because if you're emitting a lot of a persistent contaminant without fully understanding its toxicology, that can have really bad implications in the future. Generally, there needs to be more comprehensive monitoring across the board, increased disclosure of these inert ingredients that I talked about at the beginning. And then I wanted to just touch on this immunotoxicity testing because I saw in some of the questions from the first day, there was a lot of questions about, well, these are approved ingredients, they've gone through toxicity testing, but there are actually huge gaps in our understanding of toxicity of pesticides, particularly because the EPA has started waiving a lot of these immunotoxicity studies. And we know that PFAS, that from really well-studied compounds, tend to impact the immune system. So again, that's something that we definitely need a lot of data for. Other data gaps are just where these chemicals are, particularly in agricultural communities, as well as where TFA is and where some of these degradation products are. And then understanding sort of the co-exposure to all of these, I think will have really big implications. Again, that was a really great presentation from our USGS scientist who was at the first part of this conference, talked about looking for pesticides as well as PFAS, which could have potential environmental and public health implications. So thank you so much for listening. I am more than happy to take questions, and I'll end here. Thanks a lot.